Okay, so today's discussion is really about the Western regulatory landscape impacting procurement and supply chain. And of course, there's lots to consider and unpack as we go through this. One of the things that doubtless you will recognize is that that there is lots of legislation, lots of players, and quite significant industry implications and key takeaways. So I'm going to talk through each of those steps as we go through the presentation today. So if we start with the United States and we look at sort of really, we'll start with the Biden regime. When you think of, as of January 2023, Biden has signed 106 executive orders. 17% of those executive orders directly or indirectly impact procurement and supply chain management. I think what we can see is most notably probably the ones that really touch upon procurement and supply chain are the CHIPS and Science Act. So this is the bipartisan support of domestic investment in skills, jobs and supply chain resilience. Some of the key attributes of that executive order were really about pay and salaries, infrastructure, obviously the considerations around climate, not just electrical vehicles, but obviously much wider than that, of course. The manufacturing really and all the robotic and engineering skills and requirements that go with that. And then thinking about sort of all the other elements of forced labor and human trafficking, particularly the Uyghurs from northern China. We think about all the different aspects of foreign relations, and then obviously all the shipping regulations. So there are lots and lots of different facets to this as we start to look at all of those executive orders, and bearing in mind that, as I said, that perhaps it's useful to think about the fact that probably 1 in 6 of the executive orders so far have actually focused fairly and squarely in the procurement and supply chain arena. When we look particularly at the Uyghurs and look at their this particular piece of legislation, when we recognise that it's over 100,000 plus Uyghurs and other ethnic minority people are in forced labour camps in China, we can see why this became a piece of legislation. And then when we think about the fact that over 25% of the global cotton supply comes from that region, believe it or not, 40% of the world's tomato paste comes from that region. And then we start to look at all the other sort of impacts in terms of thinking that at least 1 in 5 t-shirts or shirts that we wear will come from that region. So there is a huge implication for the polysilicons, the apparel, tomatoes, cotton, and so the list goes on. But these are some of the headlines. So getting into the detail of this is really quite important. And obviously this prevents the import of goods from that region, and so has a big impact in terms of supply chains and obviously the signalling, really, in a sense, in terms of the human rights and ethical considerations around this. When we start to then think about the upcoming acts that are yet to be implemented, so the Green Act, the Clean Futures Act, and the Build Back Better Act, there are so many more things to come. And obviously this changing landscape of legislation is hugely important to procurement and supply chain, and requires an undivided focus in terms of what is coming as well as what's already in place. We think about 7 more executive orders that are slated for 2023, and we can think about the connected software applications, Department of Defense cybersecurity, loan guarantees for energy production, energy conservation standards and battery chargers, housing, and obviously there'll be clearly more to come in the second half of 2023. But many of these acts and executive orders do have direct and indirect implications for procurement and supply chain, and hence the reason for a great deal of focus is necessary not just for the US, but obviously wherever those supply chains go across the world, we need to think about, how that then flows through our supply chains as they move around globally in the complex way in which they do. If we think about executive orders by president, I thought it was quite interesting when we thought that we got a lot of executive orders from Joe Biden, but actually when we compare that against other past presidents, and I won't dwell upon the list too long, but you can see in the very, I'll call it first half of the previous century, there were huge amounts of executive orders going through. And in fact, when you look at sort of more recent times, to Barack Obama, George W. Bush, even Donald Trump, we can see that actually there's a fair degree of range and consistency from Democrats to Republicans in terms of the executive orders that come through. And again, what this does is it tells us that clearly this will continue to be a moving landscape. When we look at the United Kingdom, some of the important acts and bills from 2021 and 2022, we had 7 bills and 3 acts. Some of the key legislation focus, again, not surprisingly, was in terms of sustainability, human rights, modern slavery, infrastructure, but quite interestingly, research and innovation, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. We think about the implementation then in terms of reporting and audits and sanctions, but what we're also seeing is an increase in terms of fines, imprisonment, and indeed, what we call barring from public contracts for periods of time. There are some other significant things which are probably quite timely with the Silicon Valley Bank in terms of the Prudential Regulation Authority, which is a specific instrument in the UK. But however, it talks very clearly about the standards and the supervision required for financial institutions, their resilience, operational risk and resilience, risk management, governance, and indeed, again, climate-related financial risk, diversity, equity and inclusion, and reporting and data quality. Now we can see that this continued sort of vigilance in terms of what's required is hugely important. Excuse me. So if we think about new regulations, we think about the PRA in the financial services, some of the things that we can see in terms of the headlines that come through, senior management accountability. And again, this has been a common feature of the discussions around the Silicon Valley Bank. So again, there is a universal tenure around how this moves from one region to another, but also what we call materiality and risk. So assessing that materiality and defining, how that might then impact and fall within particularly elements of outsourcing. The elements of due diligence, risk assessment, data security controls, continuity and exit plans. Again, another key feature and discussion around Silicon Valley Bank. But again, as you can see, these are quite extensive and quite complex arrangements that do require care and consideration. But again, what this does signpost is for other sectors and other industries that this level of scrutiny may well be likely in future years for other sectors and other industries. When we look at sort of the extended producer responsibility, the EPR as we call it, which is all about sort of, the producer's responsibility for things that are not directly part and parcel of a product, such as the plastic packaging, and how this then moves through a set of effectively what I call legislative gears over the years from, the bill becoming assigned into law, and how then the taxes and then the other phases, as we see in terms of the modulated fees and business payments, then start to take effect over a series of years. So we can see that this has a 5-year initial phase, but actually sets very clear targets for 2030. When we look across into the European Union, Again, a similar sort of thing in terms of important acts and bills, 8 bills, 2 acts. But again, we'll see the same topics occurring in terms of sustainability, human rights and modern slavery, building and infrastructure, research and innovation. Again, people are very clear that they expect regulation and connectivity of research and innovation to come through into the supply chain. Obviously, the implementation of reporting, audits and enforcement, including fines and imprisonment, particularly for the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. So as we look across this whole sort of spectrum in the Eurozone, what we can see is this I'll call it layered approach towards different kinds of legislation that is developed at a country level, but also then gets subsumed then at the Eurozone level. And as you can see, the whole essence of this, again, if we look at some of the examples there, we've got examples around, child labor, we've got different things in terms of parliamentary proposals, CSO studies, and then when you start to look at the number of directives, 50,000 directives, and in the space of 3 years, 5,207 approved amendments to pre-existing legislation. So as you can imagine, this landscape is ever shifting, ever complex, and as I said earlier, what you do see is the flow through there, particularly as it flows through with goods and services from one economic region to another, is hugely important in understanding provenance, origin, and then the total, I'll call it, route for all goods and services through supply chains. When we look at the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, as we can see, the whole keyed and stepped arrangement around risk analysis, policy statements, preventative measures, right the way through to remedial measures, the classic sort of set out is there for all to see in terms of a very clear sequence of activity, from risk analysis to statements to preventative measures to complaints procedures, monitoring, remedial measures and documentation. But again, we can see right at the bottom there, we've got some very clear sanctions around fines of up to 2% on global turnovers, so not just within the country, but the total turnover of the organization, as well as other organizational fines, and as I said, banning from public procurement contracts for 3 years. So quite an extensive range of measures, but in supplement to that, there is more to come, which we'll talk about. So in terms of what's on the horizon, what that does mean is continued legislation, conflict amid legislation not being perfectly aligned across jurisdictions. So the one thing that we do see, and again across very complex global supply chains, is we haven't got a consistency in terms of which legislation might need to take priority or preference, or indeed be recognized as we flow through from prime materials through to finished goods and then dispatch into the consumer hands. And again, what we should also then recognize is that the flowing legislation that then comes with the recovery, recuperation and recycling of materials that have gone into the original manufacture of goods in particular. So this alignment will continue to sort of stay out of synchronization. I mean, we've got, I think it's something like 26 different reporting standards for sustainability. We've also got the need, particularly as witnessed in the Eurozone, the fact that obviously what we've got is a inconsistency between country legislation and Eurozone legislation. And again, a recognition that the EU Council is continued to horizon scan and consider what legislation then needs to be updated, further what additional legislation is required, and particularly in the context of setting penalties, fines and sanctions for organisations. Obviously, there's an intensifying sort of focus, I'll call it, on ESG and sustainability requirements, and indeed increasing reporting requirements that go with that. So really, the summary out of all this for me really is that the classic sort of legal response is ignorance is not an excuse for the law. We have to comply with it. Interpretation can make or break your ongoing success, particularly when you think about the punitive damages. So, thinking about leaving legacies in organizations, that's clearly not a legacy that you would like to leave. So this whole consideration around how do I ethically govern my supply chain is increasingly important. One of the things that does strike me though is, again, given the number of suppliers that you're likely to have, the number of contracts that you're likely to have, and the interdependency and the different tiers of suppliers that you have across your global supply chains, manual tracking is clearly not a viable alternative, and therefore getting that support is not really a threat. It's about effective management of the complex supply chain ecosystem that most chief procurement officers and other leaders are responsible for. Clearly, in an organization, consistency will be key, and that's part of what most of the legislation is seeking to achieve, is that consistency. And obviously, compliance is vital, but being able to prove that you have taken effective steps and measures to put these things in place is hugely important. And obviously, particularly probably more so with the examples in the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, what we have seen is that simply doing what we call the tick box exercise is not sufficient, and that what the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act is really looking for is the plans and the ways in which you intend to effect, if you like, step changes and management and a proactive approach within supply chains to deliver the requirements of different pieces of legislation and acts. One of the things that is often given as a piece of advice to people is to say, don't wait until you've done a full analysis. Start when you've got a sufficient amount of data and information, because it's through that process that you obviously make positive strides towards engaging with the legislation. But furthermore, you learn along the journey in terms of what you can and can't do, and you learn how to then shape and think about your requirements, particularly from a data collection perspective, or what insights you're trying to derive. And so I think that's one of the key things that I would certainly recommend to people. Which of course the answer is no, it won't. Hoping that you can sort of take a fixed point in time and simply work with that is not good enough. The one thing that I say to most people again is about, if they invest in a digital platform, be prepared to accept that that's the part of a journey. It's not an end in itself. It is a continuum, a bit like the fact that the legislation is going to change and it's going to have new features, new requirements, new reporting requirements. It's going to be a never-ending, how can I put it, journey in terms of legislation. So that's all from me today, and I'll now wrap up and pass you back to the guys at Scan Market.